Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
In this section of the course, we're going to move on and start to talk about pivot charts, because pivot charts are a visual way to represent pivot table data. Because you'll find that a lot of the time when people are looking at a data set, it might be small or large, it's a lot easier for them to gain insight and look at key metrics when the data is in chart form. Now, in this first lesson, we're just going to discuss some of the different chart types that you can add in Excel, because there are so many of them and new chart types are being added all the time. But it is worth noting that not all chart types are created equal, and some charts will be better suited to your type of data than others. Now, we're kicking off in this lesson in exactly the same place we left the last lesson. So currently we have our data set sorted by region and country in the rows, product in the columns, and then we're summarizing by the profit. And if you recall, in one of the previous lessons, if we go to the Design tab, we changed the report layout to show in tabular form. Now I'm going to switch this back to compact form, and I'm also going to add back in those plus and minus buttons. Now, if I decided at this stage that I wanted to create a pivot chart, it's very easy to do. We just go up to the Insert tab, and then in the Charts group, notice we have a Pivot Chart drop-down. And if we click on Pivot Chart, it's going to open up the Insert Chart dialog box. And this is where we can find all of the different chart types that we could possibly use. Now, when we click on a chart type, let's click on Pie Chart, for example. Notice that pie isn't the only option. We have different types of pie chart listed just above. So 3D pie chart. We have a pie of a pie. We have a bar of a pie. And then we have a donut chart just here. So just be aware of that. If you click on a chart type, you're going to get different variations of that chart. Now, some of these that you'll click on, let's go for map, you're going to get this message just here. It says you can't create this chart type with data inside a pivot table. So for some of these, you can't simply click the pivot chart button and insert a pivot chart. For this one in particular, the filled map chart, you can only use data that's not inside a pivot table. And I have a whole lesson dedicated to this at the end of this section. And you'll see that with some of these others as well. For example, the stock chart type can't create a chart with data inside a pivot table. So just be aware of that. Not all options are available to you from here. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these chart types, but let's take a look at some of the most commonly used. So a column chart, that is your standard clustered column chart, which represents data in bars. This is pretty good for most types of data. I always say to people, if in doubt, use a column chart. And notice that we have different types of column chart as well. So a stacked column chart for this particular data set would actually be pretty good. We have 100% stacked, we have 3D, so on and so forth. Now, I always recommend to people to not use 3D charts wherever possible. They don't tend to look very professional, and they can sometimes kind of throw off the visualization. So in general, 3D charts aren't the best ones to use. Now, line charts, you would use these to represent data that changes over time. So if you have a data set where you're showing sales from 2010 to 2023, a line chart would be a great way to represent that data. And again, we have lots of different chart types up here, stacked lines, we can add lines with markers, so on and so forth. Now, with pie charts, a lot of people love the pie chart. I'm not the biggest fan of pie charts, apart from if you have a very small data set. So maybe if you have 2 to 5 data points that you want to represent, pie charts can sometimes work quite nicely. So you can see here, this doesn't look too bad. I can see the profit of the product broken down by region. Donut charts are similar in that way as well. If you want to use these, make sure you're using them with comparison data and you're only comparing a few data points together. Bar charts are very similar to column charts, except they just run horizontally as opposed to vertically. And we have similar options for things like stacked and 100% stacked. Bar charts in general are good for most types of data, much like column charts. Now, things like area charts, in some instances, these can work correctly. I've seen some really nice area charts, but I normally see them when they're combined with a line chart, because you can combine two chart types together. notice at the bottom we have a combo section, and this is where you might want to combine a cluster column chart with a line chart, like you can see in the example. And what I was just saying about area charts, you can see here is an area chart combined with a cluster column chart. Again, I don't love that as much. I tend to prefer area charts combined with line charts. Now, things like XY scatter plots, again, these can be useful to represent certain data sets, but these are one of the charts that you can't use when your data is inside a pivot table. Map charts, as you would imagine, are best for geographical based data. So if you have a list of countries and maybe the population and you want to show the top 5, a field map chart would be great for that. And then we get into some of the more specialist charts, so things like stock charts, surface charts, which can become really complex. Now, remember, the idea behind a chart is to make it easier for your audience to visualize those key metrics. And if you take a look at this 3D surface chart, I would say that this probably isn't going to be the best way to represent my data. It looks a little bit all over the place. It kind of looks like an origami animal. It's going to be really difficult for my stakeholders or CEO to gain any insight on the figures using this type of chart. So the point I'm trying to make here is just be mindful of the type of chart that you're choosing. Always ask yourself the question, is this easy for my audience to get to the crux of those key metrics quickly? If it's not, and you're just adding it because you like the way it looks, then you're probably going to want to choose a different chart type. Now, we're definitely not going to go through all of these chart types in this section of the course. We're basically going to insert one, and then I'm going to show you some of the formatting techniques you can use to really bring the data to life. Now, for me, I think I'm going to go for a column chart, but I'm going to use a stacked column. I think that one looks pretty good. Let's click on OK, and you can see it's going to add that to the worksheet. Now, again, I would always recommend that when you're working with pivot charts that you put them on a separate worksheet to your actual data source, so you don't have everything crammed onto one page. Just for the purposes of demonstration and to make this a little bit easier, I am going to keep this next to my pivot table. But just be aware that normally you would put these on their own separate page. It's also worth noting that you can create multiple different charts off of the same data. You could even create another pivot table, move the fields around and create an entirely different chart, and then combine all of these charts together on one worksheet to create what we call a dashboard that shows different analysis of the data. Now, that's outside the scope of this course, but just be aware that you can do that. So we're going to head into the next lesson and we're going to start to take a look at some formatting techniques that we can use. In the previous lesson, we created a pivot chart to summarize and visualize the data in our pivot table. And I created a stacked column chart. Now, when you insert a pivot chart, it's basically going to insert a standard looking chart, and it will take on the colors of whatever theme you have applied in your copy of Excel. So in this lesson, we're going to run through some really important formatting techniques so you can make your chart look really nice and represent your data in the best way possible. And it is worth noting that whilst we are focusing on pivot charts, if your data, say, wasn't in a pivot table, you just had a regular table of data, you can use all of the same techniques. And if you want to insert a chart just based off of your table data, again, you do it in the same way. You just click in the data set, go to insert, and in the charts group, you have all of these different chart options. You just wouldn't use the pivot chart drop down, you would use these instead. And it will insert a chart that looks very similar to this. Now, when you're clicked on your pivot chart, the first thing you'll notice is that you have a pivot chart analyze button, and this contains different commands that you can use to manage your pivot chart. You have a design ribbon at the top. This is where we can change the colors, change the chart style. We can change the way our chart is laid out and even do things like select additional data, change the chart type, or switch the row and column data. And then finally, we have a format tab, and this is purely there to help you adjust the colors, change the fills, change the outlines, so on and so forth. Now, the main thing you need to know about pivot charts is it's really important to make sure that you're clicked on the correct chart element that you want to format. So I'm just clicked on the chart as a whole at the moment, and this is called the chart area. How do I know that? Well, you can see currently I have a little screen tip that says chart area showing on the chart. But also, if you go to the Format tab and into the current selection group at the beginning here, you can see it says chart area. If I was to click on something else, let's just say I click in the middle of the chart just here, you can see that it now changes to plot area. So that's what I'm formatting. If I were to click on this top bar, you can see it says Series Vermont. That's what I'm formatting. The same thing with things like grid lines. I can click on those, and again, you can see in the drop down, vertical value axis, major grid lines. And notice there I clicked the drop down because this allows us to select different elements in our chart to format. Because sometimes it's quite difficult to click on specific things actually within the chart itself. So if I want to format the legend, I can select legend and it's going to highlight that in the chart. So this selection pane is a really nice way to make sure you're formatting the correct chart element. Now, aside from the ribbons at the top, which contain all of our commands, notice that we also have a plus to the right-hand side, which shows us different chart elements. So if I want to turn on axes titles, I could click this. Notice it gives me two text boxes that I can modify to give these axes titles. I can deselect it to remove them. If I wanted to give my chart a title, I can click on the chart title and it gives me another little text box and I can type my title into there. I can add things like data labels, which in this example doesn't look particularly great, but in some examples is a really nice way to actually add the value into your chart. And I can do things like move the legend around. So the legend is selected, you can see it listed here, but if I wanted to change the position, maybe to show it at the top, I can do that and it's going to move the legend to the top. So you can modify and toggle off and on different chart elements from the plus. And underneath we have a format button. So this will allow us to do things like quickly change the style or quickly change the color palette that we're using. And if we want to get very, very detailed about how we're formatting our chart, we can also right click on the chart and go into the Format Chart Area pane. Now this will pull up one of these little panes which you can move around or you can drag over and dock at the side. And this allows us to get very specific about fill color, border color. We can add effects and we can change things like the size and other properties. We also have a tab for text options, so we can change the text fill, the text outline, so on and so forth. And this pane will be different depending on which chart element you're editing at any given time. For example, if I was to click on the country labels just here, and then right click and go to Format, notice it changes to Format Axes. And now I'm getting the options that are relevant to the chart element that I've clicked on. So with all that said, let's start to tidy up this chart a little bit. Now the first thing you'll notice is that we have these grey buttons, and these kind of act as ways to filter the chart data. So if I was only interested in seeing the results for Burlington and Lux, I can click on OK, and my chart and my pivot table is going to update just to show that data. So now I'm doing a direct comparison between the profit for Burlington and the profit for Lux across the different regions and countries. Now it's also worth noting that if I wanted to maybe change what I'm displaying in this pivot chart, I can click in the pivot table, go to the pivot table analyze ribbon and open up the field list. And I can then go in and make modifications. So maybe I'm not interested in showing the country, I just want to show the region. I can grab country and drag it out of rows and it's going to modify that chart. If I want to show the sum of units sold as opposed to the sum of the profit, I can remove sum of profit from values and switch it out for units sold, and the chart is going to update. Now in this case, I want to display all of the products. So I'm going to go back to the product drop down, choose select all and click on OK. And that's going to bring all of those back again. And let's close down our pivot table fields. Now with these grey buttons, I tend to have the opinion that these make the pivot chart look a little bit messy. So if I want to do things like filtering, I'll generally filter the pivot table, which will in turn update the chart, as opposed to using these buttons directly on the chart. We can also add things like slices, which we're going to talk about in the next section, which will allow us to filter the chart as well. So for me, I like to remove these. Let's right click and we can say hide all field buttons on chart just to get rid of those. Another thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a chart title because at the moment it looks a bit strange. We just have our legend at the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move the legend. Let's move it to the bottom so it's underneath, and I'm going to add a chart title. And with chart titles, we just basically type out what this chart represents. Units sold by region and product. And this is simply a text box. So if you want to apply formatting, you can. So I might want to make that bold. I could even change the font if I wanted to, make the title a bit bigger. So this chart is starting to look really nice. So what other customizations might I want to make here? Well, if I click on my charts and go up to the Design tab, I could choose to apply a chart style. Now, a chart style, if we hover over some of these, is just a quick way of applying multiple pieces of formatting to the chart. So it means that you don't have to go through each element. Formatting it, you can just apply a style and apply it. So maybe I decide that I like this one that has more grid lines. I'm going to choose style 10 to apply it, and notice that we have a much bigger chart title as well. If I want to change the color scheme, so the overall color scheme of my bars, I can go to change colors, and what I'm going to see in here is all of the different palettes within the theme that I'm using. So I can go through and hover over and you can see the changes that that's making to my chart. Now, if you want a completely different set of colors that aren't within your color palette, then that's where you can go to the Format tab and you can get very granular about how you want each shape to be filled. So if I want to change the color of this green stack, if I click on the first one, it's going to select them all. I can then go to Shape Fill and I can change this to whatever color I like. If I don't like any of my theme colors, I can go to more fill colors and I can choose something cool from here. So let's just go for this bright pink, click on OK, and you can see how that changes. So I've just decided to use one of the color palettes just so it's still in keeping with the overall color scheme of the pivot table. If I wanted to give these little blocks an outline so that they stand out a little bit more, again, I could go to Format and I could choose a shape outline. So let's go for a black color, click on the next one, and you can outline each one with this black color so that they stand out from the other stacks, like so. So this is part 1 of chart formatting. We're going to continue on because there's so much more to show you in part 2. So I'm going to head over there now, and I look forward to you joining me. In the previous lesson, we inserted a stacked column chart, and I showed you some techniques that you can use to format the chart. So we're going to continue on with this in this lesson because there are so many different ways you can format charts. So we're going to start out by taking a look at number formatting. So if you notice in this chart, we have an axis, the vertical axis, that shows the units sold from 0 to 800,000. Now, currently, these numbers haven't got any formatting applied. So I want to make these a little bit easier to read because on first glance, you might think that this is 80,000 at the top as opposed to 800,000. So I want to add a comma separator in here and I don't want any decimal places. So you can format numbers from directly within your pivot chart. So let's right click, we're going to say Format Axes. It's going to open up the pane on the right hand side. And if we scroll all the way down, notice we have these different sections. One of them is number. So this is where we can choose to apply some number formatting from the drop down, maybe one of the categories, or if we have a very specific number formatting that we want to use, we can type it into here. Now I want something quite basic, so I'm going to go with number. And you can see immediately that applies a comma to those values in the vertical axes. But it's also added a decimal place and 2 zeros after. So this is where we have decimal places. I want to take this down to 0. And if I click, you'll see that updates. And now my numbers look exactly as I want them to look. If you wanted to add a dollar symbol, you could do it in the same way, maybe apply currency or accounting format. And remember, if all else fails and you want a very specific custom format, you can simply type it in much like you would in the custom format dialog box. Now, another thing I could do is I could increase the width of all of these bars. So maybe I want these to be a bit wider and there'd be less of a gap in between each bar. Well, what we could do is click on any of the series. And if we take a look at the Format Data Series pane on the right hand side, notice we have an option for gap width. So I can take the gap width up to make them thinner, or I can bring it all the way down to make these wider. So again, this is really personal preference. Now notice here that my vertical axis runs to 800,000, but really my values are all less than 700,000. So I can make a modification to this so that we don't have a bit of a gap at the top. So once again, if we go to the axes options, you can see here it says bounds, minimum and maximum. So our minimum is 0 and maximum is 800,000. So I could change this to 700,000. And when we click on the spreadsheet, you can see that's going to update and each stack gets a little bit wider because the top value isn't vastly different from where the values actually end in the dataset. Now I'm going to modify this table so that we're only seeing results for the products that we're in charge of. So we're in charge of Burlington, Kensington, and Lux. So I'm going to filter the pivot table by clicking the drop down arrow. I'm going to deselect everything and we're only going to choose Burlington, Kensington and Lux. Let's click on OK, and now we can see that this entire chart has updated. So now that we've done that, notice we have a huge gap between when the values end and 700,000. So if I just wanted to display these, I would definitely go back in and I would change the maximum value to 300,000. So let's open up Axes Options and I'm going to modify this to 300,000. Let's click away. And that looks a lot better. So now I have a bit more room in these stacks. Maybe I want to add some data labels. So we can right click or we can click on the plus and we can say data labels. And you can see that adds those onto the chart. Now you need to do this for each stack. So we're just going to select each stack and we're going to add our data labels. Now I don't particularly like the way that these data labels look. So I'm going to select them, make them bold, and we're also going to make them white. Let's do the same for the other stacks, like so. Now again, with these numbers, these aren't formatted in any way. So I want to add comma formatting in, much like we did on the vertical axes. So once again, with the first stack selected, we can go across to Format Data Labels, go to Label Options, and I'm going to expand Number, and we can change these to Number Formatting. I'm going to take the decimal places down to 0. So you can see that looks a lot better. So let's do the same for the other stacks. We're going to go to Number, remove the decimal places, and then the final stack, and we're going to take those decimal places down to 0. So just by knowing a few formatting techniques, you can take your chart from something that looks pretty boring to something that looks a lot more interesting. And another thing that I would always do is remove the grid lines from the worksheet. So let's go to View and let's deselect grid lines, and then I would normally remove the outline from the chart so that the chart really looks like it blends into the background. And this is particularly important if you're doing anything like designing a dashboard. Maybe you have a dark background theme and you want the chart to really blend in. So with the chart selected, we're going to go to Format, Shape Outline, and we're going to say No Outline. And then we can move that chart wherever we need it to be, maybe underneath, and we've created something that looks really nice. I just want to finish this lesson by showing you how you can insert a second pivot chart based off of the same data. Now you could copy and paste this pivot table and then build another pivot chart from there, simply by modifying the fields, but you'll find that if you do that, it's going to try and modify this chart down here when you start to move the fields around. Now there are ways to get around that, which we will take a look at in the next section. You can unlink it, but I also find that sometimes it will start to modify the formatting in this chart as well. So if you just don't want to encounter any of these issues, then you can just build another pivot chart directly from your source data. Now I want my pivot table and pivot chart that it creates to be the same formatting as this pivot table up here. So what I'm going to do is go to Design, and where we have our custom format, I'm going to say Set as Default. So what that means is that any new pivot tables that I create are going to have this formatting. If I don't do that, it's just going to apply the default formatting, which for me is this kind of blue table style. So let's go back to pivot tables. Let's click in our data. Let's go to Insert, and I'm just going to insert a pivot chart. I'm going to put it on an existing worksheet. I'm going to put it here, and let's add it just here. and click on OK. So now it's asking me to build my pivot table and my pivot chart. So maybe this time I just want to do a direct comparison of the gross sales between Asia and Europe. So I'm going to grab the gross sales field and drop it down into values, and then I'm going to grab the region field and drop that down into the axes, and then I can simply apply my filters. So I can click the drop down underneath region, and I'm only interested in comparing Asia and Europe. Let's click on OK, and you can see the pivot table and the pivot chart updates. Now, if you're wondering why we don't have this banded formatting on this particular pivot table, it's simply because of how we're summarizing the elements that I selected. We're not showing the product anymore. And of course, you could spend some time going in here, changing the number formatting. Just for time's sake, we're not going to do that. I am going to hide all fill buttons on the chart, and then I can go in and start to remove items that I don't need. So I don't really need the legend. I'm probably going to want to add a total up here. I can go to design, I can change the colors so that it matches my other charts, and I can start to apply my formatting. Now for this one, I actually want this to be a donut chart because we have a small data set and we're just comparing two regions. So I can choose to change chart type. We're going to choose pie and click on OK. And now I have my pie chart. So I can then go in, I can choose a chart style, I can add different elements such as maybe data labels, I can add a chart title, maybe a legend, I want one of those in there, and I can use the techniques that we've already demonstrated to build out a second chart. So I've just gone ahead and applied some of those formatting techniques that we used in the first chart. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I wouldn't have my pivot tables and my pivot charts on the same worksheet. I would normally have the charts on one worksheet and all of the pivot tables on another. And I'm sure you can see that if we were to copy both of these to another worksheet, so let's select this one, hold down Shift, select this one, Control C, I'm going to add another worksheet and Control V to paste those in. So what we could technically do here is remove the grid lines. We've got these two charts, and this is the basis of an Excel dashboard. We can format the background in any way we like. We can add more charts, and this just gives anybody a nice overview as to what's going on in the business. And just so you can get an idea as to the potential of this, I've just started to mock up an example of a dashboard. And this is a global sales dashboard representing the key metrics from the global megastore. And this is what we call a bento box dashboard, meaning that all of the charts are contained within separate parts that looks much like a bento box. And all I've done here, added some shapes. These are rounded rectangles. I've changed the fill color, and I've added some text into a text box. And of course, I have changed the entire background to a darker color. And I'm sure you can imagine what this would look like if you had lots of different charts on here. We could have tables on here as well. It's a great way to visually present data to CEOs and stakeholders. So I highly encourage you to have a play around with this, take a look at the different chart types and the different formatting techniques. We're going to finish off this section on charts by taking a look at another chart type, but one that can throw people off because it's a little bit harder to create. And I did briefly mention this in the first lesson of the course. So what you can see here is a table on the left-hand side that just shows the top 10 countries based on coffee production. And then we have various different metrics. So here we have values that represent how many 60 kilo bags are sold. We then have a column for metric tons, and then we have a column for pounds. And what I've done here already is I've put this data into an Excel table, and I've created a pivot table to the right hand side of this to summarize the data, but simply by sum of bags. So I've basically just extracted out of this columns 2 and 3 from the original table. Now the pivot table looks slightly different to the Excel table because in my table these are sorted in order of country. So the top coffee producer down to number 10. Now, my pivot table isn't currently sorted, so let's do that first of all. Now, if you want to sort your pivot table data, you simply need to right-click, or alternatively, you can click the drop-down and you have sort options in here. Now, I want to actually sort on the sum of the bags. So I'm going to right-click, we're going to go to sort, and we're going to say largest to smallest. And you can see that that now reorders these countries, and it should match what we have in the Excel table. Now, I want to create a different type of chart here. I want to create a map chart, because a map chart is a great way of displaying geographical data. And that's exactly what we have here. Now, if we click in the pivot table and go up to insert and try and insert a map chart, let's choose map just here, this is where we get that error message that I was speaking about previously. You can't create this chart type with data inside a pivot table. Please select a different chart type or copy the data outside of the pivot table. So we have a bit of a problem here. We can't directly create a map chart when our data is inside a pivot table. Now, how am I going to get around this? Well, I could just simply create the map chart based off of two columns in the Excel table. So I could select these two columns, go up to my charts, go to map and filled map. And it's going to create the map chart for me. But there is a bit of an issue here because I still want to have the flexibility of my pivot data. So if I decide to summarize this in a different way, maybe showing the sum of the metric tons, or maybe I want to filter this so I'm only seeing certain results, or I want to add in more columns, I'm going to want to use my pivot table over the static Excel table. So how can we get around this? Let's delete out that chart. What we can do is simply copy and paste the data so that it's outside of this pivot table. So I'm going to select my pivot data, Control C. I'm going to come somewhere underneath here, but instead of just doing a straight Control V, I'm going to go up to the paste button and we're going to say paste values only. So effectively, this data is now outside of the pivot table. Let's just bold those headings to make it a bit easier to read. So now I can create my chart based off of this data. So I'm going to select everything we have here. Let's go up to insert, maps, and I'm going to say filled map. So I get the chart that I'm looking for. Let's just make this a little bit bigger. Now, this is a perfectly fine way of doing this, but if you want your chart to be pointed at the pivot data as opposed to this unformatted data, you need to insert it in this way and then simply point the chart back to use this table instead. So all we will do here is make sure we have the chart selected, go to chart design, and we can choose select data. Now we can see the current chart data range is this data set over here, but we can change that so that it points back at our pivot table by selecting the pivot table data. Now when we click on OK, we can delete out this data down here because the chart is being controlled by this pivot table. Notice when I click on it, it highlights the pivot data instead. So now if I go into here and maybe I'm only interested in seeing the results for South America, so I'm going to select all of the countries in South America that we have in this list, click on OK, and you can see that that chart is going to update and only show me those results. And then we can format this much like we would any other chart. So if we go to chart design, I've got a few chart styles to choose from. So maybe I want to change this to chart style number 2. I can do that. I can go in, I can change the colors to something entirely different if I wanted to. So let's go for these purple colors. And then my usual chart formatting tricks apply. So the main point of this video is just to show you that when you do get that message saying that you can't create the chart because it's not pivot table data, there are ways that you can get around that and create a flexible chart. It's time now to do exercise 13. And in this exercise, we're going to practice some of the skills that we've learnt in this section of the course. Now, when you open the exercise, it's going to take you to the first tab. Now, the instructions are actually on a different tab. And you can see here over on the right, I've got click for instructions, and then we have a link to the Sales by Manager tab. So if you click that, it's going to jump you across and you can then see the instructions. Now, following on from the last exercise, you should have ended up with a pivot table that looks something like this. So now I would like you to create a bar chart from this pivot table data. And I'd like you to format the chart as follows. I'd like you to hide all field buttons on the chart. I'd like you to move the legend below the chart. And I'd like you to apply chart style 6 from the gallery. I'd then like you to use this custom format and apply it to the horizontal axes. I'd then like you to decrease the gap width between the bars to 72%. And I'd like you to change the chart colors to Colorful Palette 4. Once you've done all of that, I'd like you to remove the chart border and add a chart title that says Sales by Manager and Category. So once you've formatted the bar chart, I'd then like you to copy the worksheet and rearrange the pivot table fields as follows. I'd like you to move the date into the rows field, and I want you to show the months only. I'd like you to move store into columns and sales into values. And once you've done that, I'd like you to create a line chart, and I'd like you to format the chart so it matches the bar chart where possible. Add the chart title, Sales by Month and Store, and then name both the pivot chart and the worksheet Sales _by _month _store. So a few things to do there. If you'd like to see my solution to this exercise, then check out the file in the exercise files folder. That's it for now. I will see you in the next section.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.